Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. In this episode of The Global Agora, I speak once again with retired Australian Major General Meg Ryan. We have been having these conversations for over 3 years now. This time, we discuss Ukraine's evolving strategy of cumulative attrition, targeting not only Russian troops, and Ukraine wants to destroy 50,000 Russians per month, but also all their revenues and political pressure points. We examine whether Kiev has the means to sustain this approach, the mistakes made by all sides during 4 years of Russia's full-scale invasion, and why, despite drones and AI transforming the battlefield, 90% of warfare remains an old story of leadership, training, mass, logistic, and political will. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Meg, at the Munich Security Conference, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently said, and I quote, "For our army, the mission is clear. To destroy more Russian occupiers because they are occupiers. The goal is specific, at least 50,000 per month. Even for Russia, that would be serious, I'm sure. And it would affect Putin's decisions, because we are speaking mainly about frontline troops, those leading the assaults and attacks." End of quote. As grim as it sounds, President Zelensky is right, these are occupiers. But do you think this is the right tactic? We know that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin doesn't care about people.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is Ukraine really coming to the realization that the only strategy that can work against Putin is to hurt him more and more as each day goes by. And the way you hurt Putin is not directly, but indirectly through his economy and through the people he sends, because even though he might portray that he doesn't care about the lives of his soldiers, even he can only sustain so many casualties. I mean, there's a reason why they've avoided sending conscripts, the annual conscript drafts. There's a reason why they've avoided sending people from places like Moscow because it's politically sensitive. So there are pressure points. And the Ukrainians believe they've found a couple of them. One is the number of casualties to increase them. Another one is oil exports and the amount of money that's coming in. And Ural crude is getting much less than Brent crude oil at the moment. And the third is the Americans. I think they're having success with oil. They hope to have success with killing more Russians. The jury's out on whether they're having success with the Americans putting pressure on the Russians.
But in late autumn 2023, the then commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzhny, admitted it was a mistake to assume that he could stop Russia by bleeding its troops. What is different now?
No, he did. He said, I think his words were, "We all assumed when we killed and wounded 150,000 Russians, they'd go home. It's now around 10 times that they haven't gone home." So he was right that their assumptions were mistaken. I think what Fedorov, who's obviously spoken about the 50,000 per month target before Munich, and then President Zelensky at Munich, talking about is cumulative attrition on the Russians. So it's not just about killing more and more Russians, it's about the economy hurting more and more, which it is. It's about hurting their oil production more and more and more. So I think it's part of accumulating attrition, not just a single standalone pillar of Ukrainian strategy. I think Ukrainian strategy is larger than just the number of Russians they need to kill.
But does the Ukrainian army have the means to achieve the goals set by President Zelensky? It also has to deal with its own heavy losses.
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, theoretically it does, with the step up in the number of drones and artillery. German Rheinmetall is now producing as much munitions as can be bought. In fact, they have excess capacity they don't have contracts for, which is not the situation a few years ago. So, the Ukrainians have all the artillery, all the drones they need. It's now about How do you use them in new warfighting concepts? How do you get them into greater depth in Russian positions, just as the Russians are doing to them? So theoretically, it's possible, but whether it is possible, I mean, the Ukrainians are having shortages of troops, including drone operators. So you have to square the aspirations to increase Russia's casualties with increased defence production and increased recruiting and getting people into the Ukrainian military.
Mick, I don't know if it is possible to assess this, but over these 4 years, what was the biggest mistake the Ukrainians made on the battlefield? And did they learn from it?
Well, I think both sides have made quite a few mistakes. I think probably the biggest mistake hasn't been a battlefield one, it's been a political one, which has been to limit mobilisation from the start. If Ukraine had gone for full-scale mobilisation of 18-year-olds and up right from the start, they might be in a different position. But then again, if Europe hadn't taken several years to decide Russia really was an enemy, that got over their concerns about escalation theory, we might be in a different war as well. The war might be over. Russia might be home having lost if Europe hadn't argued for a year about whether tanks and artillery were escalatory. So, the big mistakes were Europe too slow to move on supporting Ukraine at the scale that was needed, and Ukraine not going for full-on mobilization right from the beginning of the war.
You partially answered my next questions because, of course, I wanted to ask you also about the Russians and the Ukrainian allies. So what was the biggest mistake the Russians made on the battlefield, and did they learn from it?
Biggest mistake the Russians made was making too many bad assumptions about Ukraine and NATO. They assumed that Ukrainian politicians were corrupt and would leave. They didn't. They assumed the Ukrainian army was the same one they faced in Crimea in 2014. It was not. And they assumed that NATO would act the same way it did when Russia illegally occupied Crimea, and they didn't. So the biggest mistake Russia made was its assumptions about the war going into it, which fundamentally showed a lack of humility on the part of the Russians. They were very arrogant. They thought this would be a cakewalk. And as the history of war over thousands of years show, when you think like that, you're generally going to have a problem.
So, and now, what was the biggest mistake Ukraine's allies made? You mentioned a couple of things, but have we learned especially from the very slow political decisions?
Yeah, I think very slow decision-making, very timid decision-making in the first year or two of the war. It probably took a couple of years for many in Europe to really internalise first that war was possible in Europe in the 21st century, that this wasn't an aberration in Ukraine. This was the reality and could be the future of Europe if they didn't sort their act out with spending and deterring Russia. Second, I think that they miscalculated Europe's real strength. It's a much richer, it's got a bigger military, it's far more powerful than Russia is, and they didn't appreciate just how powerful they were for some time. That slowly dawned on them, but that appreciation should have come much sooner than it has. So I think, Europe really forgot what war is. It forgot how to deter war. It forgot how to fight wars, and that's something that it's having to learn the hard way, but much too slowly.
If we look at the battlefield now, you wrote a couple of pieces about Starlink, for example, and how the Russians cannot use Starlink anymore and what it could mean and what it won't mean. You wrote also that the pattern of conflict on the ground, in the air, and in the infosphere remains dreadfully familiar. So maybe if you could say a few words about what we are now seeing at the battlefield, what are the main trends after 4 years?
Well, I think the key trends, we're seeing the saturation in the use of drones. The penetration of drones into warfare in the last 4 years is certainly unprecedented. Drones have been around for about 85 years, but the level of saturation, penetration into the air, land and maritime domains is thoroughly unprecedented. It certainly has changed the character of war. We are seeing the increasing penetration of artificial intelligence and these kind of technologies as well. But I think the war is also a bigger lesson about war isn't changing too much because the same old things matter, whether it's good leadership, good training, whether it's the importance of information operations and logistics, whether it's the importance of a cohesive society and civil defence. There are far more old lessons being relearned than there are new lessons from this war. In fact, I would say 90% of insights gleaned over the last 4 years, be it about strategy, be it about deterrence, be it about tactical operations, logistics, and the use of mass, but 90% are old lessons that are being relearned. It's the 10% that a lot of people focus on, whether it's drones, AI, and these kind of things. But I think it's the 90% we have to pay attention to because it's the 90% that you win wars through good strategy, through good leadership, through linking tactics all the way through to political desired outcomes.
What about the Starlink I mentioned? We saw that Russians were using it. Elon Musk switched it off, and it seems for Ukrainians it was an opportunity to make some, even taking over the territory we haven't seen from 2020 to the speed of it. So how important is this?
Well, I think it's important. I think there's a few insights here. The first one is don't predicate your tactical communications on pirated satellite communications. You know, own your own sovereign satellite communications, or at least have ironclad contractual arrangements for that. I mean, it really was a stupid institutional approach that the Russians undertook there. Secondly, it showed that surprise is still possible, as the war has shown throughout, and the battlefield is not transparent. It's highly visible, but you can't see into the hearts and souls of men and women on the front line. So it's not transparent, and surprise is still possible. But when surprise is generated, it has a limited time effect. The Ukrainians were very good, very opportunistic at exploiting the surprise the Russians had at not having the glue of communications. But that will wear off over time as the Russians adapt, as they find new ways of communicating, and as they develop counterpunches to the Ukrainians.
The large-scale Russian invasion, of course, has lasted now 4 years. I know that you regularly visit Ukraine, and you mentioned a couple of things now, but how has these 4 years changed your view of armed conflict in the 21st century? Do you see anything fundamentally different compared to February 2022? And you said 90%, 10%, but maybe your personal view also from your personal experience in Ukraine.
Well, I think we have seen some things that are changing the character of warfare. You know, drones and AI, I think, two big ones, but also the speed and breadth of learning and adaptation. It's occurring at a pace that I think is unprecedented and, frankly, hard to comprehend in most places out. And I mean, the Ukrainians are learning and adapting at a speed that is incomprehensible to most Western bureaucrats. So we're seeing that. That doesn't mean that's going to be exactly the same in every future war, in every place. This war is unique because of geography, the participants. Ukraine forces are entirely unique. They have a different history, a different outlook, a different kind of existential threat perception. Be that as it may, drones and AI are here to stay in every conflict moving forward. They'll just be used differently. I think a second thing is that there have been things we have not seen in this war that we will see in other conflicts, whether it is high-level, high-attrition space operations, whether it is high-level air campaigns that we just haven't seen from brute aircraft, amphibious operations, littoral operations, these large-scale naval combat. We haven't seen these in this war. So, that again says to me, Ukraine is not the future of war, but there are many things that have happened in this war that will happen in every future war. But I think most important for me is that there are far more continuities. There are many things that we've seen in this war we've seen in every other war for thousands of years. And they're mainly the human elements, the uncertainty that everyone has to face in war, the surprise that often occurs at the tactical all the way to strategic level, the requirement for excellent leadership at every level, the fact that mass still matters. You can be as smart as you want, but mass still does matter. The violence and influence are two sides of the same coin that is war. That has not changed. You still want to influence your adversary's population whilst killing the enemy. And you want to ensure that what you're doing on the battlefield is meeting political objectives. And whilst this was codified by Clausewitz, it's a very old idea going all the way back to the Greek city-states. So, that's how I see the war. That, there's some new things that are changing the character of war. There are some things we have not seen that we will see in other conflicts, but there are many continuities that indicate to me that the enduring nature of war, its human elements, the uncertainty, the fog, the friction, these kind of things have not changed. Whether it's a large war like Ukraine or middle-sized wars like the Middle East or small raids like Venezuela, each of them offer insights into the changing character and the enduring nature of warfare. Some will provide lots of insights and lessons, some will provide a few, but they all build a case and provide insights into the phenomenon that is war. And I think that's the most important thing we need to understand is war is a phenomena. It's a human phenomena. It's been around for 5,000 years or more. It's not going away anytime soon. And each of these case studies give us a sense of the breadth and depth of war. And as Sir Michael Howard once said, you have to study war in breadth, depth and context. And I think that is extraordinarily good advice.
Talking about this, according to a Wall Street Journal report, a major NATO drill last May revealed how unprepared Western forces remain for high-intensity combat dominated by drones and real-time battlefield intelligence. A single team of about 10 Ukrainians acting as the adversary counterattacked NATO forces in about half a day. They mock destroyed 17 armored vehicles and conducted 30 strikes on other targets. Are we doing enough? I mean, the Western armies, are we doing enough to learn the right lessons from all of this?
Not yet. We're still moving too slowly. Ukraine has an existential threat, so it moves quite smartly and quite quickly. NATO does not have an existential threat, or at least it doesn't perceive it. So that drives a different risk calculus amongst senior military leaders and bureaucrats. It's not that they're not learning. It's just that they're not changing procurement, organisations, warfighting concepts fast enough. I mean, I think that exercise where the NATO forces loss was an important data point, but, we need to be careful not to extrapolate too much from that because it was a training exercise. And these kind of training exercises are deliberately designed to induce failure. You train to failure. A great example of that is the American Combat Training Center, where every combat team that goes through fails. And the reason for that is you learn far more from failure. It's far safer to fail in training than it is in war. So I think, I'd like to see more about the context of the training activity. I think it was the right thing to do, but I'd love to see the training design and how it all went down just to have a sense of, was this designed that they would actually fight to failure like this? Or was it something that was totally unanticipated?
But, for example, in your country, do you see any changes in training of Australian Defence Force because of what's going on in Ukraine and around the world, and also because of what's going on in the Pacific area? And of course, I'm not saying that Australia will face any conflict anytime soon, but you are also living in quite an interesting neighborhood. So let's put it that way.
I think Australia's learning from Ukraine started way too late. It wasn't until last year that there was any kind of formal project to analyse the lessons from Ukraine in the Australian Defence Force. That's really not an optimal way of doing this. It's professionally deficit to do it that way. There were some who just thought Ukraine didn't provide lessons for us, and I think that's madness. It does provide lessons for us, but you have to, as I wrote last year, translate those insights for use in the Pacific region. It's very different geographically, different terrain, weather, very different adversaries. I mean, we have China, Russia and North Korea, and very different political environment. There's no NATO out here. There's far more fence-sitting countries than there are supporting democracy and the defence of Taiwan. So there's more we could have done earlier, learning from the war in Ukraine. There's more we can do to learn from the wars in the Middle East. But, there's also a lot of learning going on through an extraordinary array of regional exercises between Japan, Australia, the Philippines, United States, New Zealand, and others to get back into high-level amphibious, maritime, cyber and space operations against a peer enemy.
Mick, you also recently wrote that the brutal calculus of the past 4 years will continue into 2026 unless there is a significant breakthrough in technology tactics or strategy that changes the deep, close, and real aspects of the overall battlefield dynamic. The only other factor that might significantly change the trajectory of the war is a major shift in political will in Kiev or Moscow. So, do you see anything that could change the overall battlefield dynamics in 2022? Or what could lead to a significant shift in political will in Kiev or Moscow?
If the first happens, the second might happen, but I don't see either happening at the moment. Neither side has come up with the all-new warfighting construct like, say, the British did in 1917 on the Western Front. So until we see that, you're not going to see more pressure put on either side than what they have at the moment. It's going to remain a pressure cooker rather than a more maneuver-oriented conflict. When it comes to political will, I don't see either Russia or Ukraine bending at the moment. I mean, Ukraine quite rightly has said we're fighting for our homeland. Why should we give up our territory when, this was an illegal act of international aggression by the Russians? But Putin, whether he wants to go home or not, can't anymore. He's built this massive military edifice in his country, not just the military, but defence industry, the war economy. And he has to leave his soldiers in Ukraine until he can show he's got some kind of victory for all the casualties, all the treasure that's gone into this war. So both Ukraine and Russia, I think, are really not going to move a huge amount in negotiations. Certainly that appears to be the case again in Geneva. But, I think Ukraine has been remarkably flexible in its posture towards negotiations over the last 6 months or so. Russia has not changed its tune at all in 4 years, and yet the American negotiating team keep going to the Russians thinking next time they'll be different, and they're not. So it's not just where you would need change in Ukraine and Russia. You're going to need a change of mindset in the White House. You're going to need a change where the White House sees this not as a business deal, but as a real war. And the only way to change the calculus is put a lot of pressure, more pressure on one side or the other. The side that the Americans should put the pressure on is the Russians.
But here I see a problem because I think that the Americans are putting much more pressure on Kiev than on Moscow. And also, it seems to me that basically what the White House is hoping for is that Kiev will simply, at one moment, decide to take the deal because basically under the threat that what happened next might be even worse. So do you think there is a possibility to change the views of the Americans?
Well, I mean, the key American decision makers here don't know anything about national security. They certainly don't understand war and what it means. They don't understand Ukraine or Russia. They understand business deals, and they think the best deal is with Russia, not Ukraine. Ukraine's understanding is what comes next without a peace deal might be worse. What comes next with a peace deal at the moment will absolutely, definitely, 100% be worse for the Ukrainian people. Because the Ukrainians have lived under the Russians before. They know what a brutal, awful regime they have lived under multiple times before. It's ended up in millions of Ukrainians dying. At the moment, hundreds of thousands, millions of Ukrainians live under Russian occupation where they are routinely tortured, looted, raped, children kidnapped, these kind of things. Their history expunged. So the Ukrainian calculus is things are bad right now, but there's no way they're as bad as living under the Russians, and we're not going to allow that to happen. And that is, I think, one of the core foundational parts of Ukraine's negotiation strategies. We are never going to live under the Russians again. And fair enough, why should they?
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.